Nearly 2,000 years ago, Pompeii, a glorious city of Rome, was suddenly destroyed by lava. Centuries later, archaeologists began a massive excavation to reopen this time capsule. Archaeology often reveals the wonders of the ancient world: magnificent palaces, precious objects, and lost civilizations. But sometimes what emerges from beneath the earth is not just stone and earth, but silent screams and frozen pain. These discoveries not only tell us history, but also remind us how fragile life is and how cruel time is. Today I am taking you on a journey to the saddest discoveries hidden in the shadows of the past. If you are ready, let's witness these tragedies frozen in time together. Baby sewerage. Some secrets are hidden in the most unexpected places. In Ashkelon, Israel, when archaeologists began excavating the sewers beneath an ancient Roman bathhouse, they expected to make an ordinary discovery. But what emerged from the mud was one of history's most shocking tragedies. Small bones, hundreds of them. At first they didn't realize what they were up against, but everything changed when the bones they found turned out to belong to about 100 newborn babies. The terrible truth slowly began to take shape. The first suspicion was that this was how unwanted babies were disposed of, as girls were considered less valuable in Roman society. But the analysis made everyone even more astonished. Most of the bones belonged to male babies. So what could have been the reason for the deliberate dumping of male babies in the sewers in Rome? Researchers have speculated that the baths were not just a place of rest, but may have been a center of dark deeds. It has been suggested that babies born as a result of unwanted pregnancies linked to prostitution were disposed of in this gruesome way to keep them out of sight. We will never know the real cause. But one thing is certain: this discovery is one of history's most shocking and tragic secrets. And if that's disturbing enough for you, the next discovery will shake you even more deeply. Buried alive. Imagine. You wake up in a dark void. You have difficulty breathing. You can't move. You're trapped in a narrow space. And most frightening of all, no one outside can hear your screams. Researchers believe this is exactly what happened to a young woman in ancient China. Her mummy tells a story that makes your blood run cold. She was only 25 years old. She had just given birth, but the placenta was not completely removed, leading to a fatal internal hemorrhage. Her family thought she was dead and rushed to make funeral arrangements. But that's when the real tragedy began. The woman was not dead. She opened her eyes in a small coffin, a moment of panic, fear, and shortness of breath. Her arms were twisted, unable to move, desperate just to stay alive. The traces the researchers found reveal this desperation. Scratches and fractures on his fingers and toes. The lining of the cloth inside ripped away piece by piece. All are silent witnesses to her desperate struggle to escape the coffin. But the thick walls of the coffin muffled her screams. No one heard them. In the end, exhaustion, lack of air, and excruciating pain, the worst nightmare a human being can experience, became his last moment. Coffin birth. Death must be the end of a story. But what if sometimes it's the beginning? Imagine this. You open a tomb and discover that the woman inside gave birth after she died. It may sound like a medieval legend, but this is a completely real event that happened in a small town in Italy. Dating back to the 7th and 8th centuries, in this tomb, a pregnant woman died just 2 weeks before giving birth. But the real shocker came centuries later when her grave was opened. Archaeologists found small bones near the woman's legs. These were the remains of a baby that had not finished developing in the womb. But how did the baby come out after its mother had died? The scientific community calls this chilling event a coffin birth. The medical term is post-mortem fetal extrusion, a rare phenomenon. When the mother's body begins to decompose, the gases that accumulate inside cause the fetus to be pushed out. Sounds horrible, doesn't it? But the story doesn't end there. On the woman's skull, there was a trace of a primitive surgery called trepanation, a small hole drilled into the skull. This was done since the Neolithic period to treat various illnesses, fever, seizures, or headaches. Unfortunately, the woman had died either from this treatment or from the cause of her illness. But the biological processes in her body continued even after her death. And so the baby was born in the silence of the tomb. Sometimes nature blurs the boundaries between life and death in such a disturbing way. The next discovery will remind you of the destructive power of nature in a much more dramatic way. Explosion victims. Some disasters bring not only destruction, but also horrible stories forever. In 79, when Mount Vesuvius erupted, Pompeii was thrown into chaos. In mere hours, the ancient city with its once bustling streets and laughter-filled squares disappeared under volcanic ash and rocks. Over the centuries, countless movies, TV series, and novels have tried to tell the story of that fateful moment. But believe me, what real excavations reveal is unlike any fiction. In 2020, archaeologists uncovered a villa just outside Pompeii, and inside, a moment when time stood still. Two bodies side by side, one a rich man, the other his slave. They had survived the first explosion. Perhaps they thought the walls of the villa would protect them. But the second explosion the next day turned that hope to ashes. Their bodies hardened like stone by the thermal shock, their hands and feet clamped together. In that moment, it was as if they were frozen in their struggle to survive. But this is not the only tragic scene in Pompeii. Dozens of bodies found in the city reveal the desperation of people in their final moments. Families huddled together in their homes praying. People freezing in the streets as they fled. People hugging their loved ones as they breathed their last. Even the poets of the time wrote poems about this catastrophe. But these frozen moments, preserved under the ashes for thousands of years, speak in a silence beyond words. And as you begin to feel the weight of this tragedy, children of Lule Laco. In the unforgiving peaks of the Andes, there was a secret hidden for centuries. Beneath the freezing winds and ice, an eerie story forgotten by time, but hidden by the mountains. When archaeologists discovered the bodies of three children 6,000 meters above sea level, chillingly preserved by the cold air, everyone's blood ran cold. But this was not an excavation, but the silent echo of a sacrificial ritual. These children were offered to the gods in the Inca Empire's sacred ceremony known as Capacocha. The Incas believed that children were the purest offerings to appease the anger of the gods in times of crisis or important events. But what made this ritual most terrifying was that the children were still alive when they were placed on the mountain. They had been drugged, they were sedated with cocoa leaves and alcohol. Archaeologists found traces of these substances on their bodies. They didn't resist because they didn't realize the pain, or didn't want to be. The oldest of the three was a girl of about 15, known as Doncella. She was cross-legged, her head slightly bowed. It looked as if she was just sleeping. Next to her were a 7-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl, their faces timeless. Their little faces seemed to whisper the silent story of this tragic end. To the Incas, these sacrifices were not the bearers of cruelty, but of an honorable duty. They would protect their people and find eternal peace in the eyes of the gods. And over time, the ice has preserved them, carrying their story to this day. Even the intricate weavings and ornaments on them are still as intact as the first day. Spooky, isn't it? These children have found an immortality frozen in the silence of the mountains. Bound mummy. Sometimes a tomb speaks louder than the person inside, and this discovery in Peru tells an eerie story from thousands of years ago. When archaeologists unearthed a mummy from nearly 1,200 years ago in the heart of Peru, at first glance it seemed like an ordinary discovery. But the position of the body was anything but ordinary. That's where things started to get strange. The mummy's hands covered its face. This gesture, reminiscent of someone afraid of death, immediately raised questions. Was he afraid? Was he in pain? Or was he hiding from something? Stranger still, his whole body was tightly bound with rope. This scene has opened the door to a number of theories in the minds of researchers. Was it punishment for a criminal? Or was it part of a ritual to prevent the soul from returning? Or perhaps it was a form of protection prepared for the afterlife. And one more question comes to mind. If this person was a criminal, why was he carefully buried in an official burial chamber? Or if it was a ritual, What was the fear behind being so tightly bound? The answers are still hidden deep in the ground. Perhaps we will never know. But one thing is certain. The mummy covering its face is no coincidence. It's a scream, a fear, perhaps regret. Swamp men. The seemingly quiet peat bogs of northern Europe are not just water and mud. Dark secrets from thousands of years ago are buried in these waters. And some are so well preserved that it's as if they died yesterday. These ancient corpses, known as swamp men, represent one of history's most gruesome discoveries. Buried in a swamp, some of these bodies are more than 2,000 years old, but their skin texture, hair, and even facial expressions are surprisingly intact. But this remarkable preservation cannot hide the horrifying reality. These people did not die in peace. The first major discovery came in Denmark in 1950. A woman was cutting peat when she came across a body known as the Tallinn Man. It was so well preserved that at first she thought it was a murder victim. His hair, his skin, even the expression on his face could still be read. But closer inspection revealed that the man had been strangled and there were rope marks around his neck. This suggested that he had been a sacrifice to the ancient gods. The Tallinn Man was not the only one. Old Croghan Man and Rail Man, found in Ireland in 2003, were other examples that made your blood run cold. Their painful stories were hidden in their bodies. They were beaten, mutilated, and had their throats slit. They were tied by the hands and thrown into the swamp. Each one was part of a ritual sacrifice or a cruel punishment. And why? At the time, people resorted to such brutal rituals to appease the anger of the gods or to maintain the balance of society. Fear, faith, and violence. When combined, they could bring a person to this point. But perhaps the strangest thing was how the swamps had preserved these bodies so perfectly. Most of them had their internal organs and even their brains intact. Today, these people stand as silent witnesses to death, faith in the darker aspects of human history. The next story will show how fear drives people to unthinkable measures. Vampire tomb. Finding a vampire's grave. Sounds like a myth, doesn't it? But sometimes superstition and fear reach such a level that people become afraid even of the dead. This tomb in Poland mirrors the dark horrors of the 17th century. When archaeologists discovered the skeleton of a woman thought to be a vampire, they were stunned by the meticulous measures taken in the tomb. A sharp sickle had been placed above her neck. The reason was simple but frightening, so that if she rose from the grave, she would slit her own throat when she moved. But the sickle was not enough. A padlock was also placed inside the tomb. This medieval superstition believed that the souls of vampires could be locked away to prevent them from returning from the dead. Here's the even scarier part. This was not an isolated incident. When plagues and mysterious diseases ravaged villages, people searched desperately for scapegoats. There are vampires walking among us. Rumors spread. The result? Preposterous measures against dead bodies. Some had large stones placed in their mouths. Some had stakes driven through their hearts. Others were buried face down. Throughout history, people have done unimaginable things out of fear of the unknown. Today, we may not believe in vampires, but we're still looking for different monsters. And sometimes the accusers are far more frightening than the beings they are trying to stop. Shimao sacrifice pits. Sometimes it's not just stones that are buried beneath a city, but terrible secrets too. Excavations in the ancient city of Shimao in northern China have revealed just that. Initially, these remains were thought to be the remains of a simple ancient barrier. But as the excavations deepened, a much darker and shocking truth came to light. At the heart of the city stood a stepped pyramid, but the real horror was hidden beneath the pyramid. Archaeologists discovered 6 carefully placed pits filled with the skulls of 80 young girls. Yes, you heard right, 80 young girls. And each one of them was a silent witness to a horrific ritual. Human sacrifice was not an unusual practice in ancient China. People were sacrificed to make offerings to the river god Hebo. Wealthy nobles took their concubines and slaves to their graves at death. But what makes this discovery in Shimao even more disturbing is that the motive behind the victims is still unclear. Were these young girls part of a spiritual ritual, or were they sacrificed in such a brutal ceremony to send a political message? Some experts believe that these sacrifices may have been offered to increase the city's protective power or to intimidate enemies. But one thing is certain: each skull is a silent testament to the suffering and lives lost. Shimao is not just a ruin of stone walls. Beneath it, the darkest aspects of human nature are buried.